You were never supposed to hear what I'm about to tell you, not because it's secret, but because it's cursed. The last man who tried to read these words aloud, the sheriff's grandson, was found hanging in his barn in 1952, his fingernails blackened, his eyes wide open, as if he had seen something standing in the corner, something waiting to be remembered. So before we go further, understand this. Once you know the name Lydia Harper, you cannot unknow it. The mind doesn't let go of certain shadows. It only learns to live among them. Now, listen closely. In the autumn of 1879, deep in the Tennessee hills, in a hollow that locals still refuse to map, there stood a house made of limestone and silence. The Harper homestead. No birds ever nested there. No travelers stopped to rest. The locals said the soil around the house was sour, that even in spring nothing green would take root. And the woman who lived inside, Lydia Harper, a widow, a teacher, a healer of sorts, had eyes so pale they seemed to drain the color from the room. They said she could cure a fever with a whisper, but that she could also make the dead speak if she wanted to. Most people thought that was just talk, Appalachian superstition, the kind that lingers in places where the churches were built on older ruins. But something happened there one October evening that erased an entire generation from memory. A gathering of neighbors, a prayer vigil. 23 souls walked into that house. 14 never came back. And when the authorities arrived, every mirror in the home had been covered with black cloth. This is the part they scrubbed from the archives, the part the local historians call the gap. You won't find it in the records of Carter County or in any Tennessee Gazette. It was ordered destroyed by the Reconstruction Office in 1880, along with Reverend Amos Blackwell's journal, the only eyewitness account of what really happened in that limestone room. But fragments survived, and when you read them together, when you listen beneath the ink, you begin to see a pattern, not just a tragedy, but a system, an old system, a method of control stretching back through the centuries, cloaked in piety, sharpened by power, and fed with human belief. Because Lydia Harper wasn't just a victim of madness or myth. She was part of something older, something organized, and the ritual she performed that night wasn't random. It was sanctioned, recorded, and repeated in other places, other names, other years. You've seen its fingerprints in modern times, though you never recognized them. That's how true power works. It hides in plain sight. Let's begin at the beginning. After the Civil War, the hills of eastern Tennessee were cut off, wounded, isolated, stripped of faith and industry alike. People returned from the battlefields with ghosts still walking behind them. The economy collapsed. The churches split. And in the vacuum, other kinds of authority crept in. Quiet ones, unseen ones, groups that promised meaning in exchange for obedience. They didn't call themselves cults. They called themselves circles, societies, orders of prayer. But the symbols carved into their hymnals told a different story. The Harper homestead was one of those places, a meeting point for the faithful and the frightened. And Lydia Harper, widowed at 43, educated, literate, and soft-spoken, became their vessel. It said she inherited an old book from her husband, Jeremiah, a stonemason who had once worked for a traveling sect of builders. He called them the Congregation of the Threshold. No one knows who taught him their symbols, but he carved one of them into the stone above the cellar door, a 7-pointed circle with an inverted cross at its heart. To outsiders, it looked like nothing. To those who knew, it marked a boundary between flesh and spirit. between man and something else. Lydia guarded that cellar like it was sacred. No servant was allowed near it. No child was permitted to touch the handle, and when visitors asked why, she'd smile and say, "That's where the silence sleeps." In October of 1879, 10 years after the first incident, yes, the one erased from record, she announced she would hold another gathering. A harvest vigil, same date, same circle of chairs. But this time, the men of the county refused to go. Only women came. Wives, widows, sisters, 19 of them. They said Lydia wanted to teach them something, a prayer not found in any Bible, one that could heal grief. She said the war had left holes in the world, and she had learned how to close them. The following morning, the valley was silent. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but no one answered the door. When the first deputy arrived, he found the front room spotless, chairs arranged in a perfect ring, a Bible opened to Revelation, and a single red thread stretched across the circle's center, tied from chair to chair like a web, and in the middle of that web, a black candle still burned, though it had no wick. The wax itself glowed. No bodies, no footprints, no sign of struggle. The neighbors called it witchcraft. The sheriff called it hysteria. The newspapers called it the Carter County disappearances. But privately, the investigation reports, the ones buried in the East Tennessee Historical Society's restricted archives, spoke of something far stranger. One line appears over and over in the surviving notes. The air inside the Harper cellar hums. No one could explain it. The vibration was faint, like a heartbeat in stone. They closed the property, sealed the cellar, and built a fence. Within a year, the house was abandoned. Within 10, even the path leading to it was overgrown. But if you think this is just the story of one haunted house, you're missing the point. Because the Harper method, as it came to be known among occult circles, reappears again and again in history. In 1901, in a church basement in Kentucky, 13 parishioners vanished during an overnight fast. The survivors spoke of a circle, a voice, and the sound beneath the sound. In 1933, outside a monastery burned down after monks allegedly attempted to speak to the sleeping ones. Their journals contained diagrams identical to the pattern carved beneath the Harper cellar. And in 1972, a Tennessee preacher named Harlan Vess described being visited by a woman with pale eyes who handed him an old leather book, the same one once buried 3 feet beneath that limestone floor. He burned it, or said he did, but the next year his congregation disappeared too. Coincidence? History doesn't do coincidence. It does repetition, because the ones who write history are the ones who mastered the cycle, turning ritual into religion, control into comfort, faith into obedience. And Lydia Harper's story is not the origin. It's a glimpse, a crack in the system, a moment when the machinery faltered and the truth slipped through. You see, power doesn't just control what you believe. It controls what you're allowed to remember. The Harper curse, the reason it's banned, isn't about ghosts or blood or superstition. It's about memory, about erasing inconvenient knowledge. And once you realize that, you start seeing how much of your own history has been rewritten the same way. The empires that civilized the world erased thousands of Harpers, women, scholars, healers, scientists, who understood how belief shapes matter. They didn't burn witches because they feared the devil. They burned them because they feared competition. The night Lydia gathered her followers, she was reenacting something ancient, something older than Christianity, older than kings. A ritual meant to collapse the boundary between what is seen and what is hidden. And the cost of that act is always human. Blood is just the ink. The signature is the soul. They say when she spoke, her voice deepened until it wasn't hers anymore. They say she named something that shouldn't have a name, and in naming it, she gave it entry. That's why those who returned couldn't speak, why their eyes flickered when shown candlelight. They had seen it. And once you've seen, you can't unsee. The language itself changes you. If you're still here, listening, you're already part of this. You've opened the mental door that the state, the church, and the academy tried to lock shut. Because these stories aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to awaken, to remind men that behind every sermon, every symbol of faith or law or liberty, there are hands guiding it, the same hands that pulled Lydia Harper's strings, the same hands that wrote your history books. They don't fear death. They fear exposure. Because when you see how the pattern repeats, the illusion of authority breaks. And when a man's illusion breaks, so does his obedience. So consider this your first descent, the first crack in the glass. Because what happened in the Harper cellar wasn't an accident. It was a demonstration, a test of how far human belief could bend before reality itself gave way. A study funded, observed, and covered up by people who understood that the mind, not the sword, is the true weapon of empire. And Lydia, whether willingly or not, became their vessel. Remember her name. Remember the silence beneath the hills. Because the deeper we go, the more you'll realize this isn't just about one night in 1879. It's about every hidden chamber of history. Every rewritten page, every truth that was traded for comfort. And before this is over, you'll start to see the same pattern in your own life. The circles of obedience you sit inside without question. The invisible commands you obey without knowing. That's where this story begins. Not in the Harper house, but in the echo of its design. A design still alive in the institutions around you. Church, school, media, government, all variations of the same. Architecture. Each one with a root cellar of its own. Each one humming softly beneath the floorboards. The winter of 1879 pressed upon the Tennessee hills like a suffocating shroud. The Harper plantation, once a symbol of wealth and nobility, had begun to rot from within. The family's name, etched in courthouse ledgers and whispered through southern parlors, no longer carried grace but a quiet sense of dread. Lydia Harper, the daughter at the center of this silent collapse, rarely left her room. The once lively sound of piano keys drifting through the parlor had been replaced by long silences, the kind of stillness that makes even the walls seem to listen. Servants whispered that her father, Ezra Harper, had locked her away for her own good, though none dared question what that meant. Ezra was not a cruel man in the traditional sense. To those who knew him, he was educated, calculating, precise, a man of reason. Yet beneath that precision lived a disease of control. He believed in perfection, in the symmetry of bloodlines, the discipline of order, the hierarchy of human worth. His plantation, sprawling across hundreds of acres of fertile southern land, was his cathedral, and everyone who lived upon it, family, servant, or slave, was a piece of its ritual. Lydia's body, heavy and soft, was an embarrassment to that ritual. Her obesity, he claimed, was a sin against the legacy of her mother, a woman whose beauty and refinement were spoken of like myth. Her death during childbirth had left a hole that Ezra filled not with grief, but with obsession, a fixation that would later bloom into something unspeakable. By early spring, the staff noticed strange deliveries arriving from Nashville, barrels sealed with wax, labeled for preservation. The housekeeper, an older woman named Ruth, reported seeing Ezra carry the barrels into the cellar himself, refusing assistance. That same week, Lydia's screams were heard echoing through the western wing. They were not the screams of pain, but of terror, the kind that begins with confusion and ends in resignation. No one intervened. In those days, the boundaries between family and property blurred under the authority of the patriarch. Ruth prayed nightly that whatever haunted the girl would pass, but prayers have little power in homes already cursed by their own sins. By summer, the plantation's slaves began reporting sightings, figures moving near the old cotton shed long after sundown. At first, it was dismissed as superstition, but when the dogs refused to approach the western field, and when the horses spooked at invisible shapes, even Ezra grew uneasy. He ordered that a trench be dug behind the barn to drain water, though there was no rain. Ruth would later recall the smell that rose from that trench, the sour mix of blood and lye. She said it lingered for days, clinging to the laundry, to the skin, to the very air. Lydia's condition worsened. Her body bore bruises not of accident, but of punishment. When she appeared at supper, a rare occurrence, her eyes avoided her. Fathers, he spoke to her as one speaks to a broken instrument, lecturing about discipline and purity, about the filth of indulgence. The guests, uncomfortable yet complicit, said nothing. In that age, the sins of the powerful were not called sins. They were called authority. Behind Lydia's quiet obedience lay a storm of shame and hatred so deep it seemed to warp the air around her. The house itself began to change. Paint peeled faster than it should. Mirrors cracked without reason. Servants claimed that the cellar door, the one sealed after those barrels arrived, sometimes rattled at night, as if someone inside were trying to get out. One boy swore he saw footprints leading from the trench to the door, though it hadn't rained for weeks. When Ruth told Ezra of these things, he dismissed her. "Imagination is a woman's curse," he said coldly. But later that night, when he thought no one saw, he placed a Bible upside down on Lydia's bedroom door and nailed a horseshoe above it, an old superstition meant to trap evil. Then came the night that changed everything. July 3rd, 1879, the eve of Independence Day. While fireworks erupted miles away in the nearest town, the Harper estate fell into unnatural silence. Ruth awoke to the sound of something heavy dragging across the hallway floor. The lantern she carried flickered as she followed the sound to Lydia's door. It was open, wide open, for the first time in months. Inside, the room was in ruin. Curtains torn, the mirror shattered, sheets soaked in something dark. The window was broken from the inside out, and in the corner, beneath the cross that hung over her bed, lay Lydia's diary, open to a page stained with tears. The final entry read, "He said purity must be restored through the body. If I am to be remade, I pray my soul does not return." Lydia was gone. The search began at dawn. Ezra, pale and trembling, ordered every worker to scour the fields, the riverbanks, the woods. For 2 days, nothing. Then, on the third morning, they found her, or what was left of her, down by the river, half buried in mud, her dress torn, her hair clotted with blood and lye. The coroner wrote, "Drowning," But those who saw her body said otherwise. Her hands were raw from clawing, her lips split open as if she'd screamed until her voice broke, and carved faintly into her chest were 2 words: Father's blessing. The funeral was private, closed coffin. Ezra ordered the workers to dig her grave behind the chapel, far from the family plot. The preacher's sermon was short, mechanical, hollow. Ruth said Ezra never once looked at the casket, only at the ground, as though fearing something beneath it. That night, thunder rolled across the hills. The storm was unlike any they'd seen. Lightning struck the chapel steeple, setting it ablaze. Ezra stood outside in the rain, unmoving, as the cross burned and fell. He didn't rebuild it. In the weeks that followed, something changed in him. He stopped speaking to anyone. Meals went untouched. His eyes seemed to follow things that weren't there. And then the incidents began again. A servant found muddy footprints on the staircase, small, bare, leading upward to Lydia's room. Doors slammed on their own. The piano, untouched for months, began playing at night, always the same melody Lydia once practiced, Wayfaring Stranger. When Ruth gathered the courage to confront him, Ezra only said one thing: she was never meant to die. She was meant to return clean. Those words spread like rot through the house. Some servants fled. Others stayed bound by debt or fear. Rumors spread through town that the Harpers had dabbled in something unholy, rituals borrowed from old Appalachian folklore, mixed with distorted scripture. People spoke of the body cleansing, a practice whispered about in certain circles, a ritual meant to purify a sinner through degradation and suffering. It was said to have been brought over by settlers from the Old World, remnants of pagan rites disguised as Christian penance. Whether Ezra practiced such a thing or merely believed he could, no one knew. But what happened next erased any doubt that something unnatural had been set loose. Late August, when the air hung heavy and foul, a new worker was brought to the plantation, a tall, quiet man named Samuel. He'd been sold twice before, his back marked by years of labor. Ezra gave him a peculiar task: to maintain the western wing and tend to the relics inside Lydia's room. Every night, Samuel would hear whispers, not human, not animal, but something caught between. The sound came from behind the wall near her bed frame. Once, while repairing the wood, he swore he saw flesh, pale and swollen, pressed against the cracks. He fled, refusing to return. Days later, he vanished entirely. His quarters were found empty except for a single scrap of cloth, a corner of Lydia's dress. By October, the estate was cursed. Crops withered. Wells turned foul. A fever swept through the workers' quarters, killing 5 within a week. The doctor refused to visit. Locals began calling the property Harper's Hollow, and by winter it was abandoned. Ezra was last seen wandering the cemetery at dawn, muttering prayers in a language no one recognized. 3 days later, he was found dead in the cellar, the same place he once sealed those barrels. His hands were folded over his chest, and his eyes had been replaced with 2 silver coins, an ancient sign of passage into the afterlife. On the wall behind him, carved with something sharp, were the same words found on Lydia's body: Father's blessing. The house remained untouched for nearly 40 years. Nature reclaimed what man had cursed. Trees grew through the windows. Vines strangled the porch. But the legend of Lydia Harper lived on, passed down in whispers, in ghost stories told by firelight. Some said her spirit roamed the riverbank, searching for her lost body. Others claimed she visited the homes of cruel fathers in the dead of night, her bloated figure appearing at their doors as a warning. But among historians, there exists a darker theory, one buried deep in the archives of Tennessee folklore, that Ezra Harper's rituals were not born of madness, but intention, that he sought to create something eternal, a vessel through which his family name could never die. When the state repossessed the land in 1918, workers clearing the cellar found something sealed behind the brick wall. 7 small barrels, each marked with initials. Inside were organs preserved, labeled, dated. The final one bore the letters LH, and beside it, a single note written in Ezra's hand. She will rise when the world is clean. She will rise when the world is clean. By the spring of 1880, the Harper estate stood silent over the Tennessee hills, its windows blackened like blind eyes. Locals had begun crossing themselves whenever they passed the gate. Farmers swore that no birds nested in the oaks that bordered the property, and even the wind seemed to avoid the house, curling instead through the empty fields where cotton once grew. When the county sheriff finally received orders to investigate the abandoned property of public concern, few men volunteered to accompany him. The memory of the Harpers, especially the whispers about the daughter's death still, clung to the valley like smoke that refused to clear. Deputy Caleb Raines was 27, earnest and too young to remember the worst of the rumors. He was chosen precisely for that reason. The sheriff believed a man untouched by superstition might see clearly. They rode out at dawn with a preacher, Reverend Jonas Marin, whose church had once baptized the Harpers, and a clerk to record whatever they found. The plan was simple: enter the home, catalogue possessions, secure documents for the county archive, and ensure no unlawful burials remained on the land. But the closer they came, the heavier the air grew, humid, metallic, as if the house exhaled something old and waiting inside. Decay had turned elegance into ruin. Velvet curtains hung like rotting fruit. The grand staircase bowed under their boots. In the parlor, the piano lid was open. A single key depressed itself when the wind moved through a cracked pane. The sheriff muttered that it was only pressure and air, but the reverend's eyes told another story. On the mantel lay a collection of small glass jars filled with cloudy liquid specimens of snakes, birds, and something unidentifiable. Each bore Ezra Harper's handwriting, neat and deliberate. The labels numbered as though part of a study. They found the first real clue in the library. Behind a row of theological texts rested a locked chest, its brass tarnished to green. When forced open, it revealed a stack of journals bound in leather. Inside were Ezra's notes, meticulous, scientific, yet drifting into madness. He wrote of ritual preservation, of flesh as vessel for spiritual rebirth, of the body purified through separation. Reverend Marin's hands shook as he read. The language was half scripture, half chemistry, an unholy marriage of religion and science. He whispered, "This man tried to sanctify decay." The sheriff ordered the journals, sealed and sent to Nashville for examination, but that night, at their temporary camp near the gate, none of the men slept. The air carried faint music piano chords, slow and deliberate. They returned at first light, determined to finish. In the cellar, they discovered the wall where Ezra had died. Chisel marks suggested someone had worked from the inside out, not the other way around. The smell of lye lingered even after decades. In the corner stood 7 small barrels, long since emptied, yet lined with residue that glimmered faintly when touched by lantern light. Caleb pried open the 7th. Inside was a parchment sealed in wax. It bore the stamp of the local church cross within a circle and the handwriting of Reverend Marin's predecessor, Father Ogilvy. The document was a confession. Dated August 1879, it stated that in fear of scandal and heresy, the Church of St. Michael agrees to safeguard the records of the Harper matter and render spiritual closure through exorcism rites performed in secrecy. The signature was followed by 3 witnesses, 2 deacons, and the county magistrate. The implication was clear. The church had known, had intervened, and had buried the truth. Reverend Merrin grew pale. He explained that Ogilvy had vanished in the same year, his disappearance officially blamed on illness. Now, in the flickering light of the cellar, the Reverend understood the illness was conscience. They left the house in silence. Officially, their report to the county omitted the confession. But Caleb, driven by something he could not name, made a copy before surrendering the original. He carried it hidden in his coat for years, fearing both divine retribution and human wrath. 2 weeks later, Nashville authorities arrived to retrieve the journals. By then, Reverend Merrin had already faced quiet pressure from his superiors to cease public discussion of the Harper incident. The bishop called it an affair of mental instability, not theology. Yet the more Merrin read Ezra's writings, the more he recognized the pattern: distorted passages from Leviticus, diagrams resembling alchemical symbols, and repeated references to the 7th vessel. One line chilled him most: when spirit and decay reconcile, the line between resurrection and blasphemy will dissolve. To Merrin, this was no mere heresy. It was a doctrina, secret cultic theology masquerading as medicine. In May 1881, a fire consumed the Nashville archive that housed the journals. Official cause: faulty lantern. Unofficial whispers: sabotage. The same night, the county clerk who had witnessed the investigation died of poisoning, his tea laced with mercury chloride. The coincidences piled like stones on a grave. Merrin and Caleb met in secrecy, piecing together what remained from memory. They concluded that Ezra's experiments had not been solitary. The language implied correspondence letters to the brethren in Charleston and the Society of the Glass Heart. None of those names appeared in public records. Caleb left the sheriff's office soon after, taking work as a surveyor along the river, but he never escaped the Harper shadow. In 1883, when a flood unearthed part of the old cemetery, workers found several coffins filled not with remains but with jars identical to those in the Harper parlor, each containing fragments of bone suspended in alcohol. The county ordered immediate reburial, yet one jar went missing before officials arrived. Weeks later, a fisherman downstream reported finding a glass container washed ashore. Its label half-erased, but still legible: Specimen 8, Continuance. Meanwhile, Reverend Merrin began preaching against the sin of forced salvation, a phrase few understood. His sermons grew fevered, warning that men who attempt to purify the world through control would summon only rot. Parishioners drifted away. By autumn 1884, he was dismissed for heresy and mental instability, echoing the fate of Ogilvy. Before leaving town, Merrin confided in Caleb that he intended to visit the ruins one last time, to consecrate what should never have been touched. He went alone. When he failed to return, a search party found his horse tied at the gate, reins intact, but no sign of him. Only his Bible remained, lying open to the book of Job, the margins filled with the words, LH, the living host. Years turned to decades. The Harper estate became legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children about pride and punishment. But every generation, someone curious enough to dig encountered fragment bones that did not belong to any single body. Pages of formulae, a ring engraved with the initials EH in 1918. When the state reclaimed the land, those discoveries reignited the investigation. Scholars from Vanderbilt examined the surviving journals, now partly restored from memory, and concluded that Ezra Harper had been part of a broader 19th century movement, blending alchemy, anatomy, and revivalist religion. They called it the doctrine of purified flesh. Its adherents believed the body could be refined like metal, sin burned away through chemical transformation. It was science as sacrament, faith as experiment. But even the scholars grew uneasy. Their leader, Professor Langford, wrote in a private letter that the remaining texts carried a malignant rhythm. He claimed the handwriting altered mid-sentence, as if another mind had seized the pen. Weeks later, he withdrew the team, declaring the material spiritually unsafe. The journals disappeared again, this time into a university vault where access required written permission from the dean and the state archivist. The vault remains sealed to this day. As for Caleb Rains, old age found him haunted by unfinished questions. In 1927, he gave a recorded testimony to a local historian. His voice, brittle yet firm, spoke of a covenant between knowledge and guilt. He insisted that the true horror of Harper's Hollow was not ghosts or curses, but the human desire to and sanctify control, to turn domination into doctrine. "We keep calling it madness," he said, "but madness that writes in scripture soon becomes belief." That tape, rediscovered in the 1970s, resurfaced in a Tennessee folklore archive and reignited public fascination. Yet even now, no one has located the missing confession of Father Ogilvy or the specimen labeled VIII. Today, visitors who trespass near the ruins describe hearing a low hum like glass vibrating beneath the earth. Geologists call it subterranean resonance. Locals call it Lydia's breath, the echo of a family's attempt to purify itself through horror. The county erected a fence in 1994, but still the curious come. Students, ghost hunters, historians of faith. They bring cameras and leave with silence. For in the hollow, even modern light feels reluctant. What was buried there is not a spirit or a curse, is the lingering echo of an idea that salvation can be manufactured, that flesh can be redeemed through control. It is that belief, not the dead, that still haunts the Tennessee hills. The fog rolled low across the riverbanks that bordered the remains of the Harper plantation, curling like breath from something not yet dead. It was here, among the cracked gravestones and ivy-strangled iron fences, that Reverend Jonathan Pike met the only living soul who had seen the Harpers alive, the old caretaker. Silas Reed, bent by age, his back arched like a bow. Silas carried the look of a man haunted by time itself. His eyes, grey and wet as morning dew, flickered with both terror and a kind of grim loyalty. He had worked on the estate for nearly 70 years, longer than any man had a right to live under its shadow. When Pike first approached him, Silas refused to speak. He simply stared toward the manor's decayed facade, the blackened windows like the eyes of a beast. The Reverend offered him water, a small comfort, but Silas only whispered, "You shouldn't have come here, sir. The ground still remembers." That phrase, "the ground still remembers," echoed in Pike's mind for days. It was not just the whisper of an old man, he thought. It was confession wrapped in warning. So he returned again, notebook in hand, determined to record every syllable before death carried the last. Witness into silence. The second meeting took place in the ruins of the chapel, beneath a ceiling half collapsed and heavy with vines. Dust danced in the shafts of sunlight like restless spirits. There, Silas began to speak, his voice trembling yet deliberate, as if the story had waited decades for air. He told of the final months of the Harper family, of a house sinking into madness, long before the tragedy became legend. Mr. Harper, he said, had grown reclusive, his wealth consumed by strange experiments. He filled the West Wing with jars of preserved organs, animal bones, and curious mixtures that fumed through the halls. He claimed it was medicine, a cure for his daughter's illness. But Silas saw it for what it was, obsession cloaked in science. Lydia, frail and pale as candle wax, rarely left her room. The servants whispered that she spoke to things unseen, to shadows that gathered in corners and answered back in low, wet tones. I heard her one night, Silas murmured, eyes darting to the dark. She wasn't prayin', sir. She was begging something that weren't human, to take the pain away. Pike's pen stopped mid-sentence. He studied the old man's face, searching for delusion or deceit. But there was only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a secret too long. Silas went on. The night Lydia died, thunder cracked over the plantation like the sky itself was breaking. The other workers had fled weeks earlier, claiming the air in the house burned their throats and made the walls bleed rust. Only Silas remained, bound by loyalty or fear, perhaps both. He had gone to check the stables when he heard a scream, not from the girl, but from the father. By the time he reached the main hall, the candles had all extinguished. In the dark, he smelled iron and decay. Then came the sound, not footsteps, not sobbing, but dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor. He never saw what it was. He only remembered the silence afterward, a silence that felt alive. When dawn came, Lydia was gone, and her father was found kneeling by the hearth, muttering scripture that made no sense. His hair had turned white overnight. A week later, he vanished too. Only his study remained locked, the key hanging from a nail driven into the wall, a cross made of rusted metal and gilt. Silas left that day, walking until the sound of the crows faded behind him. But he said the dreams followed, always the same one, the girl standing at her window, whispering his name through glass slick with rain. Reverend Pike listened in silence, his throat tight with dread. "And you never told anyone?" he asked. Silas shook his head. Who'd believe a slave that outlived his masters? I buried what I knew. I thought the earth would keep it quiet, but the ground it don't forget. Pike's hands trembled as he closed his journal. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Reverend asked, softly, "Silas, do you believe she still walks there?" The old man's gaze drifted toward the manor, its silhouette burning black against the late sun. "I don't believe, Reverend." I know, that night, Reverend Pike returned to his quarters in Salem with more than notes. He carried an unease that sank into his bones. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of his candle, seemed to breathe the Harper name. When he finally slept, he dreamt of the plantation in moonlight, the fields swaying though no wind moved them, the house pulsing with faint light from within. At the window stood a figure in white, her face obscured, her hand pressed against the glass. Then she smiled, and the glass cracked like ice. He woke, drenched in sweat. The next morning, Pike sent word to the diocese. urging them to send records of any exorcisms or rituals performed near the Harper lands. Weeks passed with no reply. Then, one evening, a parcel arrived, unsigned, its wax seal bearing the faint mark of a serpent devouring its tail. Inside were photocopies of a forgotten parish record, the Harper Confession. 1847. The entry was short, written in hurried Latin, but its translation chilled him. The father sought absolution for his daughter's soul, claiming her body had been taken by an unclean thing of his own summoning. He begged for silence in exchange for donation to the church. The request was granted, so the church had known. They had buried the truth under coin and scripture. Pike felt a sickness rise in him, not just at what happened, but at how it was hidden. The Harper curse was not only born of sin, it was fed by secrecy. Determined to uncover more, Pike returned to the plantation once more, this time alone. The sky was copper with dusk when he arrived, and the wind hissed through the grass like a warning. He entered through the broken door of the main hall, the air heavy with mold and something faintly metallic. Dust cloaked everything, furniture, paintings, memories, except for the portrait above the fireplace. Lydia, smiling faintly, her eyes painted too dark. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in them. Then thunder rolled in the distance, and the illusion faded. He walked room to room, his lantern's glow revealing glimpses of the past. Torn curtains, a child's music box, a rosary snapped in half. In the study, the locked room Silas had spoken of, he found the door still sealed. The key, however, was gone. Pike hesitated, then pressed his shoulder to the wood. The hinges groaned and gave way. Inside, the smell was overwhelming. Books had rotted into pulp, the shelves black with mold. On the desk lay a collection of glass jars, each labeled in Harper's handwriting, tinctures, powders, organs. But what caught Pike's attention was a small wooden box carved with unfamiliar symbols. Inside were pages, dozens of them, scrawled with diagrams of the human body and something else woven through it, markings that looked less medical than occult. Beneath them, a single note read, "To cure the flesh, one must command the soul." Pike closed the box. A sudden gust blew through the cracked windows, snuffing out his lantern. Darkness swallowed the room, and then faintly a sound. The music box, playing somewhere down the hall. He froze. The melody was warped, slower than natural, yet hauntingly clear. He followed the sound to the grand staircase, where moonlight spilled across the floor. At the top stood a figure, pale, slender, draped in white. The air around her shimmered like heat above a flame. Lydia. The word left his lips before he could stop it. The figure tilted its head, and in the silence that followed, Pike felt every heartbeat as if counted by something unseen. Then came a whisper, not from her, but from the walls themselves. The ground remembers. The sound grew louder, overlapping with itself, voices upon voices, until the air seemed to vibrate with grief. Pike stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his vision blurred. For a moment he thought he saw faces in the wallpaper, the servants, the father, the girl, all staring through the layers of time. Then, with a crack like thunder, the music box fell silent. When he awoke, he was outside, lying in the mud near the gates. His lantern was shattered beside him. The house stood still, black against the dawn. He didn't remember leaving. He didn't remember running. Only that when he looked down at his hands, they were streaked with ash, and the faint scent of lilies filled the air.